The plane hummed softly as it soared above the clouds, the rhythmic sound of its engines a comforting lull. Emma looked out the window, her eyes tracing the soft white trails of clouds below, her mind drifting. It had been a long flight from New York to the Pacific, but there was a sense of excitement in the air, the anticipation of the adventure awaiting them. Emma, sitting by the window, was already thinking about the sunny beaches and lush landscapes she'd read about in the brochure. Her younger brother, Ben, was slouched in the seat beside her, his headphones on, oblivious to the world. The quiet moment would be short-lived. Suddenly, a loud, unnatural noise cracked through the calm. The plane jolted, throwing Emma forward in her seat. She gasped, gripping the armrest as her heart pounded. The gentle hum of the engines turned into a chaotic growl, and before she could even process what was happening, the plane lurched again, this time much harder. "What's happening?" Ben yelped, his eyes wide as he ripped his headphones off. Emma didn't answer. She was too busy staring at the flight attendants as they rushed down the aisles, faces painted with panic, their movements hurried. Over the intercom, a voice, strangled, sharp, cracked through the static. "Everyone, please remain calm. We're experiencing some turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts." But Emma could tell by the strain in the voice that it wasn't just turbulence. There was something wrong, something much worse. A sharp, grinding sound echoed through the cabin as the plane rocked violently. Emma's breath hitched, her eyes flicking around the cabin in panic. The woman sitting 2 rows ahead of them let out a terrified scream, clutching her child to her chest. The man across the aisle from Emma, a businessman in a sharp suit, was frantically fumbling with his seatbelt. The chaos spread like wildfire. Ben, his small hands gripping the armrest, turned to Emma with wide, frantic eyes. "Emma, what's happening? What's wrong?" Before she could respond, the plane tilted sharply to one side. Emma felt her stomach drop, as though the ground had been yanked out from under her. Her heart thudded wildly in her chest. The air inside the cabin grew thick, and the oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, swinging above their heads. "Put on the mask!" the flight attendant screamed, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of panic. Emma's fingers trembled as she reached for the mask, pulling it over her nose and mouth. She barely noticed Ben doing the same beside her, his frightened face obscured by the mask, his eyes locked with hers. But before she could offer any reassurance, the whole plane began to shudder. The metal creaked and groaned in protest as the plane's nose dipped down, sending a wave of nausea through Emma's body. Everything seemed to spin as if the world had suddenly turned upside down. And then, without warning, a deafening crash rattled the entire cabin, followed by a terrifying scream from the engines. The plane dropped, faster than Emma could comprehend. Her body slammed into her seat as the world around her twisted in a dizzying blur. She screamed, her breath hitching in panic, as the floor tilted wildly, throwing her sideways. She clutched Ben's hand, but the force of the descent was too much. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the bright, blinding light of the outside world as the plane broke through the cloud layer. When Emma woke, the world was silent. Her head throbbed with pain, and her body felt stiff and bruised, but the strange quiet was the first thing that struck her. The familiar hum of the plane's engines was gone. There was no chaotic chatter, no screams, no frantic voices. Only the sound of waves crashing nearby and the faint breeze rustling through trees. She groaned, her eyelids fluttering open, struggling to focus. Slowly, she blinked into the harsh sunlight. The crash had flung her from her seat, and she was lying on sand. Sand? Her chest tightened. She pushed herself upright, her heart racing as she surveyed her surroundings. The beach stretched out in front of her, the turquoise water rolling gently onto the shore. Palm trees swayed in the distance. It wasn't the airport she'd been expecting. It wasn't even a city. It was an island. She took in a shaky breath and turned her head, her eyes scanning the wreckage. The plane was twisted and half submerged in the ocean, the wings bent at strange angles, smoke still rising from parts of the fuselage. "Ben?" Emma called out hoarsely, her voice cracking. "Emma?" came the faint reply. She turned quickly, her heart pounding as she saw Ben stumbling toward her from the wreckage. His clothes were torn, his face bruised, but he was alive. She rushed to him, throwing her arms around him in relief. Are we the only ones?" Ben whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Emma swallowed hard, her gaze scanning the wreckage again. She didn't know. But something inside her, something deep and instinctual, told her this was just the beginning. "Let's find out," she said, her voice stronger now, even though her heart was heavy with dread. She didn't know how they had survived this crash, or why they had ended up here, but one thing was certain. They were stranded. And they were going to have to survive this island, whatever it had in store for them. With that, Emma stood up and helped Ben to his feet, both of them glancing toward the dense jungle ahead. It felt like they were on the edge of something unknown, something far greater than they could have ever imagined. But the one thing Emma knew for sure? They were alive. And for now, that was enough. The dense jungle stretched out before Emma and the others like an untamed beast, filled with towering trees and the sounds of creatures that no one had ever heard before. They had barely spoken since the crash, each one lost in their own thoughts, processing the weight of what had just happened. Emma's eyes scanned the surroundings, her nerves tingling with uncertainty. How had they survived? Why had they ended up on this island? And why did everything about it seem different? Ben tugged at her sleeve, his small fingers cold against her skin. "Emma, what is that?" His voice was barely a whisper, but the fear was unmistakable. Emma followed his gaze, her breath catching in her throat. There, partially hidden by a thick cluster of vines, was something strange, something that shouldn't be there. A large stone structure, covered in moss and creeping plants, stood out against the natural beauty of the island. It didn't look like anything she had seen before. It was ancient, weathered by time, with markings she couldn't understand etched into its surface. Before she could respond, Dr. Harper, the friendly doctor who had tried to keep everyone calm during the chaos of the crash, approached them. His face was pale, eyes wide with curiosity as he looked at the structure. He adjusted his glasses nervously. That doesn't belong here. I've never seen anything like it." "Maybe it's just an old building," Clara suggested. She was another survivor, a resourceful woman who had kept her cool during the crash, but there was an edge of doubt in her voice as she stared at the structure. "An old building?" Emma echoed, incredulous. "In the middle of nowhere? This island is uncharted. We saw the map. Nothing should be here." The air around them seemed to thicken as a sudden gust of wind blew through the jungle. The trees swayed ominously, as if the island itself was alive and watching them. Emma shivered, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. "Whatever it is, we need to be cautious," Dr. Harper said, his voice low and serious. "This island has already shown us how dangerous it can be." Clara, always the practical one, nodded. "We need to find shelter. If there's something strange out there, we can't risk exposing ourselves too soon." But Emma couldn't take her eyes off the structure. It beckoned to her, calling her with an unknown force. She felt it deep in her gut. This island wasn't just some random, forgotten place. There was something special about it, something that went beyond the crash and their desperate need to survive. It was as if the island itself held the answers they needed. "We need to go closer," Emma said, her voice firm with a determination that surprised even her. "We can't just leave it. There's something important about this place. I can feel it." Ben looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear. "What if it's dangerous? What if there are other people here, people who aren't friendly?" Emma placed a hand on his shoulder, giving him a reassuring smile. "We have to take the chance. We need to know if there's a way off this island, and if that means exploring whatever this place is, then so be it." After a moment of hesitation, Clara and Dr. Harper nodded, their faces still unsure but willing to follow Emma's lead. Together they made their way through the dense underbrush, the thick vines parting in front of them like an impenetrable wall. With every step, the air grew more humid, and the sounds of the jungle seemed to become more muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The closer they got to the structure, the more unsettling it became. The carvings on the stone were unlike anything Emma had ever seen, intricate symbols twisted into complex patterns that seemed to tell a story she couldn't understand. Some of the symbols glowed faintly, casting an eerie light that made Emma's skin crawl. "What do you think they mean?" Ben asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Emma admitted, her mind racing. "But they look like they're trying to tell us something. They might be important." Dr. Harper knelt down to examine the symbols more closely. "It's fascinating. These markings, they don't belong to any known language or culture. But the structure itself is older than anything I've ever encountered." Clara glanced around, her eyes darting nervously. "This place doesn't feel right. We should be careful. We don't know what's out there. What if it's dangerous?" But Emma couldn't tear her gaze away. There was something about this structure, this place, that tugged at her in ways she couldn't explain. The mystery was too powerful to ignore. "I know," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "But this might be our only clue. We need to keep going." They continued forward, pushing past the overgrown vines that now seemed to curl around them as if trying to pull them back. The heat of the jungle pressed against their skin, and sweat dripped down their faces, but still, Emma couldn't stop. The structure loomed ahead, growing taller with each step they took, until they were standing at its base, staring up at the ancient walls. Suddenly, Emma's foot brushed against something metal. She bent down to inspect it, brushing away the dirt and leaves to reveal a small, rusted door embedded into the stone. Her heart raced. This was it. This was the moment. She reached for the door's handle, her fingers trembling as she turned it. The door creaked open with a loud groan, revealing a dark, narrow passageway leading deep into the heart of the stone. "This could be a way inside," Emma said, turning to the others. "We need to go in." Clara and Dr. Harper exchanged wary glances but nodded. With no other options, they stepped forward, one by one, entering the darkness that lay beyond the door. As Emma stepped inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them. Something ancient, something powerful. And it was about to reveal itself. The island was no longer just a place they had crashed on. It had become something far greater, a mystery that would change their lives forever. The darkness inside the stone structure was suffocating, the air thick and cool against Emma's skin. She fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking with anticipation. As the beam of light cut through the darkness, the walls of the narrow passageway revealed themselves to be carved with the same strange symbols they had seen on the outside. They seemed to pulse faintly, glowing ever so slightly in response to the light, as if alive. "This place feels ancient," Dr. Harper muttered, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Like it's been here for centuries, untouched by time. What could it have been used for?" Clara kept close behind, her eyes scanning every inch of the dark hallway. "I don't like this," she whispered. "It's too quiet. It feels like we're being watched." Emma felt a chill race down her spine, but she pushed it aside. She had to stay focused. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Something important was hidden here, something that could change everything. Ben clutched her hand tightly, his small fingers cool in hers. "Emma, do you think we're alone here? What if there's someone else on this island?" Emma paused, her flashlight flickering over the walls. "We don't know," she replied, her voice steady. "But we're not going to find out if we don't keep moving. We need to keep going for all of us." They moved forward, step by step, the soft echo of their footsteps the only sound in the stillness. The hallway began to widen, and soon they emerged into a large, open chamber. Emma's breath caught in her throat as her flashlight swept across the room. The chamber was vast, its ceiling so high that the light barely reached its farthest corners. In the center stood a large stone altar, covered in moss and vines, with more of the glowing symbols etched deeply into its surface. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy that Emma couldn't explain. This is incredible," Dr. Harper whispered, stepping forward and shining his own flashlight across the altar. "I've read about places like this, but I never thought I'd see one. It's as if this was built for something specific, something powerful." Emma's eyes narrowed. There was something about the altar, something that made her heart race. She didn't know what it was, but she had a feeling that whatever had happened here long ago, it was connected to their being on this island. To their survival. Emma, Ben whispered, his voice trembling. Look! He pointed to the far side of the chamber, where the light barely reached. Emma's flashlight followed his finger, and her breath caught in her throat. There, on the wall, was an engraving. At first glance, it looked like just another symbol. But as Emma stepped closer, the details became clearer. It depicted a group of people, strange figures with elongated limbs and faces that were both human and not. They stood around a similar altar, their hands raised toward it, as if performing some sort of ritual. Above them, in a circle, were the same glowing symbols they had seen outside. Are these people? Ben asked quietly, his voice barely a murmur. Emma didn't answer right away. She was too busy studying the engraving, her mind racing. The figures looked almost familiar, but from where? She couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen something like this before. Maybe in a dream, maybe in an old story. But the memory slipped away like sand through her fingers. We need to figure out what this means, she said, her voice steady despite the gnawing uncertainty in her chest. Dr. Harper leaned in, his eyes scanning the symbols. There's definitely something here, something we're not seeing yet. These people, they could have been, what, guardians? Priests? Something that had to protect this place? I don't know, Clara said, her voice cautious. But it's starting to feel like we're not just exploring an ancient site. It feels like we're intruding on something that was meant to stay hidden. Emma turned toward her, the urgency in her voice growing. We can't ignore it. We have to understand what's here. This is our chance to find a way off this island, or to learn why we crashed here in the first place. Clara nodded, though Emma could see the tension in her posture. I just hope we're not digging too deep. They moved closer to the altar, their footsteps echoing loudly in the eerie silence. The symbols glowed brighter now, the air around them seeming to hum with energy. Emma could feel it, the weight of something ancient pressing against her chest. Ben, still holding her hand tightly, looked up at her. Emma, what if we shouldn't be here? What if this isn't just a place to find answers? What if it's a warning? Emma's throat tightened. I don't know, Ben. But we can't turn back now. We've come this far. The air seemed to grow heavier, charged with an almost palpable force. Emma could feel it deep in her bones, a creeping sensation that she couldn't explain. It was as if the island itself had come alive, and it was watching them, waiting. Dr. Harper crouched next to the altar, examining it closely. There's something different about this stone, he said, his fingers brushing against the surface. It's warm. Like it's been active recently. Recently? Emma echoed, a shiver running down her spine. What do you mean? Before he could answer, there was a sudden, low rumble beneath their feet. The ground trembled, and a loud crack echoed through the chamber. The symbols on the altar flared with blinding light, and the entire room seemed to shake. Emma's heart raced as she looked around, the air vibrating with an energy she couldn't control. What's happening? She whispered, her voice shaking. Then, as if the island itself had heard her, the walls began to shift. The carvings on the altar glowed brighter, casting long shadows across the room. And Emma realized, with a shock that sent her heart pounding in her chest, that the island was alive. And whatever it had been waiting for, it had just begun. The mystery of the island was unfolding before them. And there was no turning back now. The room shook violently, the air thick with an unexplainable energy that seemed to pulse from the very stone beneath their feet. The ground trembled, and Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the glowing symbols around them flared with blinding light. For a moment, everything went silent, deafeningly so. The faint sounds of the jungle outside, the crashing waves on the shore, even the breath of the survivors seemed to fade away, swallowed by the force emanating from the altar. What is happening? Ben gasped, clutching Emma's hand tighter as the light grew brighter, almost blinding. Dr. Harper stood frozen, his eyes wide with awe and fear. This is impossible," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the roaring energy that filled the room. "This altar, this place, it's activated. I've read about such things, but never seen anything like this in person." Clara, wide-eyed and trembling, backed away, her face pale. "We need to get out of here. Whatever is happening, it's not safe." But Emma couldn't move. She felt as if the island itself had reached into her soul, pulling her toward it. The symbols were no longer just markings, they were alive, pulsing with an energy that seemed to beckon her closer. She couldn't explain why, but she felt an overwhelming need to understand it, to connect with it. "Emma!" Ben tugged at her sleeve, his voice sharp with panic. "We have to leave!" But Emma didn't listen. She took a step forward, her feet almost moving on their own. She was drawn to the altar like a magnet, her gaze locked on the glowing symbols that now seemed to dance before her eyes. The rumble beneath their feet grew louder, shaking the walls and sending dust and debris falling from the ceiling. The altar's glow intensified, casting an eerie light that seemed to reach out like tendrils, wrapping around Emma's body, pulling her closer. Suddenly, a loud, deep voice echoed through the chamber, so powerful it seemed to vibrate the very air. It was neither human nor animal, but something ancient, something that had been waiting. "Who dares disturb the sacred grounds?" The voice thundered, reverberating in Emma's chest. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. It was a voice that felt like it belonged to the island itself, an entity older than time, older than anything Emma had ever known. Dr. Harper took a step back, his face pale with fear. This isn't just an altar. This place, these symbols, this is something much more than we thought. We've awakened something." Clara's voice trembled as she spoke. "We need to leave now, before it's too late." But Emma remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the altar. The voice had not been a warning, it was a challenge. The island wanted something, and Emma realized, with a shock that went straight to her bones, that she was the one it was calling. She was the one it had chosen. A sudden, blinding light erupted from the altar, and the chamber was filled with a deafening roar, a sound that was part wind, part thunder, part something else. The walls seemed to shift, the stone groaning under pressure, and the ground cracked beneath their feet. Then, as quickly as it had started, everything went silent again. The light faded, and the tremors stopped. Emma blinked, still standing before the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. The others were still behind her, eyes wide, filled with fear and uncertainty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something had been awakened. And it wasn't going to let them leave without answering its call. Ben tugged at her arm urgently. "Emma, what's going on? We have to get out of here." Dr. Harper was on his knees, his hands on his head, clearly shaken by the power of whatever had just happened. This isn't just an island. It's a place of power, a place of ancient energy. We shouldn't have come here. We've made a terrible mistake." Emma turned slowly, her gaze meeting Dr. Harper's, and she saw the fear in his eyes. But it wasn't just fear, it was all. And maybe, just maybe, a glimmer of hope. He wasn't just scared. He was trying to understand. "We need to figure this out," Emma said, her voice steady, though her own heart was racing. "Whatever this is, it's a part of the island. And it's part of us now." Ben's face was full of fear. "Emma, we don't know what we're dealing with. What if it's too dangerous?" Emma nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She wasn't sure she could explain why, but she knew they couldn't run away. They couldn't just leave this place behind. Not without understanding it, not without discovering why they had been brought here. The island had spoken to them. It had called them. And Emma knew, deep in her bones, that this was no accident. Their survival, their crash, everything had led them here. They had been chosen for a reason. "Look," she said, her voice firm. "We have no choice but to face this. We can't go back. Whatever this island wants, we have to find out. We're not leaving until we understand it." Dr. Harper took a deep breath, wiping the sweat from his brow. I think you're right. We need to understand it before it's too late. Clara looked uncertain, but she nodded. Then let's figure it out together. And so, with the echoes of the island's power still ringing in their ears, they turned back to the altar, determined to uncover the secrets of the Island of Hope. Emma didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: their journey had only just begun.